Sorry, guys. I think I'm gonna just go ahead and try to get started here. Let me share my screen. All right. Yeah. So today we're going to talk about yes. As you guys know, last week was the annual Arsene conference, and yeah, we were there as with a lot of folks. It was a great show, and I just wanted to talk about kind of some takeaways from that. Also during that call, I'd also given a talk that we can kind of talk about here. And maybe we'll do something interesting. Josh, I see you're on the call. Can you speak like am I able to speak to you?
I mean, I can hear you right now. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. All right, great. Well, the other host that's usually on wasn't able to make it today. So, Josh, I hope it's okay. I'm gonna put you on the spot. How's
Oh
that?
no.
Well, actually, Josh and also Richie Christian. Like we've got Richie on the call too. Thanks a lot for joining, Richie. We've been really happy to have you on the show for the past couple of shows. So I think what we'll do.
Glad to be here.
Thanks. I think what we'll do is I'll just like go over some of these slides, and we'll do something fun. So rather than me just kind of speaking about these slides, maybe we'll have you guys try to guess what the context or what the talking points for each of these slides should have been, and then we'll just kind of talk about them. So how's that? So
Good.
So the first one is this slide. So per the rules of the game, you'll have to guess what my talking point for this slide was supposed to be.
You're going to miss changing diapers while you're at the conference?
Yeah, I mean that's close. I was just promising to change both the wet diapers and the poopy diapers whenever I get back home. This was the longest time I was away from home from this little guy for a while, so I was just saying that. But yeah, I think that was a great guess. I'm gonna skip over this one because it's probably obvious what this one was about, and of course our services that we provide our clients, some of our happy clients here. So this one's probably obvious what this was. At the time, I was only given 20 minutes, which is kind of difficult to go over all of the intricacies of like all software med device in like 20 minutes. So I just had to say a disclaimer. This one is kind of related to that. Okay, how about this one? So what do you think the talking point of this slide was?
I'm going to say something about like balancing your approach to putting together a submission, and that you should, try to balance against what is necessary to have a safe and effective product, but not, do work that's not necessary, have unnecessary excess.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I think it's why we're in the game, right? These are not just abstract products. They're going to be used on real patients, wherever they fall in the clinical workflow, whatever risk associated with these devices. So I guess you're balancing how fast you get to the market versus doing the right thing. And it can be tricky at times. It sounds pretty simple, but it can be tricky going through a development project as a team.
Yeah, definitely. And really the only experience I would add to that is it's difficult to know when to stop, right? Like guidances say, and like 14971 says that you want to do risk analysis, you want to ensure that you've identified and properly reduced risks where possible, but they don't quite tell you when to stop, right? And in theory, like you could go on forever doing it. And that has happened to me where we've gone on probably way too longer than what was necessary. And I think knowing when to stop really comes back to this rule is you should stop when you feel like you've got a safe and effective device that you'd feel comfortable using on yourself or also your family as well. And yeah, that kind of gives a sense of like the threshold of like how much is enough to do. It's abstract, but this is kind of the best guiding principle that we've got. All right. Hey, George, how you doing?
Good, Yujan.
Yeah, so the game we're playing is like we're gonna go through these slides that I'd present Arsene, and we're gonna try to guess what the talking points are, just kind of discuss about our own personal experiences on them, just have an interesting conversation. So
Great.
how about this one? Straightforward sample size. Yeah, how about this slide? Josh, what do you think?
Let's see here.
And also George and Richie, if y'all have any thoughts too, just feel free to jump in.
This is a tough one.
I mean, this makes sense to me in that there's two different things when you talk about like the performance of a device, and there's the kind of statistical performance in terms of the result raw results, and then there's the performance of how does it actually perform, against the intended use.
So we're talking about the subgroup analysis, right, Yujan?
So this is just saying that the statistical power analysis only tells you if your experiment is valid, but it doesn't tell you if your device is going to generalize to the overall US population. So my understanding, like the way I explain this, is like your experiment is statistically powered if you can like differentiate between these two bell curves. Like if the bell curves are far apart, you need fewer samples to be able to tell with a level of confidence that these are indeed two separate distributions, or if they're the same distribution. Like the stats analysis, the stats power analysis just tells you, how many samples you need. Like if they're very close distributions, you need a lot more. Very far, you need a lot fewer. But it doesn't tell you if your device will generalize when it makes it into the post market. And commonly, like I've seen folks get confused, or they will they'll kind of over index on just the statistical power analysis in itself, but not look into like, does this match the US population data? Does it represent all of the race and also ethnicities in the US? Things like that, you also have to bake into your study as well.
Mm. Yeah, I guess so much of the effort kind of goes into the primary endpoint, which is where a lot of the stats kind of are, driven at. But generalizability kind of goes into the subgroups, right? As George was saying, and that's super important, especially for AI ML and having, the right models that are gonna acquire the images, for example, and a whole bunch of factors that go into it. So yeah, super important. And yeah, I see, this is more of a punchline, right? Statistical power doesn't equal generalizability. So I'm sure you managed to catch people's attention there.
Yeah. This one, this definitely gets a lot of people, and it's unfortunate because you can't prove that it's going to generalize, right? It's not something that you can prove in the pre-market. That's only something that in the post-market you will be able to really show that, which is why I think FDA is putting a strong emphasis on post-market surveillance now, that like it's really hard to know this up front. But in the post-market, that's where you can really get a sense of that. So, all right. So how about this one? So straightforward sample size determination. How much is enough for non-CADI or for non-CADX type stuff? I say 200 subjects with 3 readers. Yeah. Any ideas on what this slide was supposed to be about?
I mean, I know that this is a common area of concern for a lot of companies. How do you come up with this number, this kind of ambiguous goal and yeah.
You mean like 200 n equals 200? What is the confidence interval and the quality level of that number?
And it kind of dovetails back to this previous slide where like you can't really prove that's going to generalize in the pre-market, but FDA wants you to like show that you've thought about that. If you can't prove it, then how do you set the sample size? And if statistical power is not enough, then what do you use to set the sample size, right? Usually what I've seen, like the distributions that we're trying to measure are sufficiently far apart that the sample size power calculation ends up being like n of 10 or something pretty small. But obviously if you go to FDA and say that, hey, we're just going to have n of 10, they're most likely not going to let it through. And because they're going to cite, well, with 10 we're not confident that that's going to generalize, right? So what we found over the years of just going back and forth with FDA several times is like, I think there's kind of 2 different categories of the studies that are needed. And I'm going to split them up into like, I think there's a like, if you know what I'm going to call it white box, or not even white box really, Like if this is segmentation type algorithms, probably fall in this bucket. CAD-E probably falls in here as well. Some CAD-X, I think, could fall in here, but it depends on how understood the underlying algorithm is. And I would say these, like I'll say, ballpark estimate of 200. Like if your sample size is 200, I think you're in fairly good shape for the study. But then there's this other category where I'm going to call this, like, I don't know, big black boxes, where these are studies like you have pathology proven data and you've trained a classifier, and you don't know how the classifier works. Like it's just a big black box. For these, like I would put the required datas into like greater than 10,000. That's like the sample size that you would need to prove that this big black box neural net classifier thing is working as you intended. So it's a big scale difference, right? But these are the best rules of thumb that I could come up with. I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts about these.
If you're talking about attributes data versus variables data, it's been my experience that variables data requires a smaller sample size. An attribute, meaning, good or bad, or comparing it against a gold standard, that's where you need a higher number. Does that follow your experience?
By variable data, you mean?
Variables data means a measurement, a continuous number. So when you're measuring continuous data, the sample size is smaller. I know for probably the sake of this conversation, we're talking about attributes, good or bad, like a binomial distribution, and that's where N is higher.
I think it has more to do with the explainability and like the ease of determining if the algorithm is correct, and also to like find out if there's any defects with like the processing of it. I think that's probably what I think, and also risk as well. Like there's risk in this, but this is all assuming that it's like the same type of risk. But the less you know about the internal workings of the algorithm and how it's broken out, the more sample size you'd need. And I think on the extreme end, like if you have just outcomes data and you have a big CNN that like classifies something, like you need a lot.
Would you put your MRMC studies in the big black box category here?
Usually these big black boxes don't need MRMC. And my justification for this is like usually this is some outcomes data that has like a pathology confirmed diagnosis or some other ground truth that doesn't depend on human performance.
Right.
So you're not necessarily trying to measure how much better the human is than like, because it just doesn't, like, I think it doesn't really make sense in that case. But I think the MRMC study comes down to here because there is a human in the loop and there's a strong component of that the standalone performance study and the ground truth you get from that would be the same N. So the N of 200, like you'll get 3 readers to annotate this and get a ground truth, and then you'll get like 12 readers to do the MRMC study on the same data. So the sample size would be the same for both.
Yeah, one other factor that I'm aware of that could influence this is the level of automation. I think they talk about manual, semi-automated, and automated, and usually the amount of effort required in terms of validation would be proportionate to that as well.
Yeah.
That's been my experience anyway, is that you need more rigorous data the further along you go in terms of your task automation.
Yep. Great points. So yeah, okay, let's move on. This one's pretty straightforward, but basically more than 50% of your data must come from the US. And again, why do we think that is? Like, why do you think US says that? Like, or the US FDA, like they've said this on almost every pre-sub and almost every application that we've done, is they want to ensure more than 50% comes from the US.
I think it's because if you look at the mission of the FDA is to protect the public of the US public. And so this is not official, but like you said, it comes back on additional information requests. And so I think that the FDA wants to ensure that the practice of care in the USA is covered. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
I thought it came from this, I can confirm after, from this guidance document on evaluation reporting of age, race, and ethnicity specific data in medical device clinical studies. Nothing to do with AIML. But I think it's in this context, it's also to do with maybe generalizability to a certain extent. And I know they can be flexible with literature-based justification on why you could get away with less than 50. Yeah, but I think in this context, it's probably also a lot to do with generalizability.
Okay, so it's inferred in that guidance document that you mentioned, and it's not specific to AIML.
Yeah, I think so. I need to confirm this, but it comes from somewhere.
Yeah, I know that I've gotten in trouble for this. Well, I shouldn't use the word trouble, but it seems like before, let's say 2020, the FDA wasn't looking at this or following this guideline. And then on subsequent 510Ks, the FDA will challenge what they cleared several years ago. And then the burden is on you to show that it's not a problem, that it's the same standard of care. But what do you think, Yujan?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think the same. And like your first point, George, about FDA's mandate is to protect the public, mostly the U.S. public, right? Like they're getting clearance to do pre-market authorization in the states, so they want to make sure that it would generalize in the states. And again, you can't prove that something's going to generalize before you actually put it, but there's rules of thumb, right? Like, and this 50% is another rule of thumb, and the source of this is like an FDA guidance is where this rule of thumb comes from. And yeah, like the multi-reader study we were mentioning before, like we've seen 12 readers seems to be like a happy middle ground. Again,
Where did you get the number 12 and 12 as opposed to, let's say, 10?
now this one doesn't have like a guidance document that we can really point to. It's more of like we've been through FDA either through pre-subs or like getting whole letters back from FDA. Sometimes if we go too few, they might ask for more, or if we've gone to too many, they're not going to ask for more. So it's kind of a judgment call. It's like, well, like maybe 12 is a good number to shoot for based on that. It's kind of the same way that we came to this N of 200 is like a similar way. Like we've tried to do N of 40 and that was too little. And we've done N of 500 and there was no complaints. So like it's kind of a guessing game a bit about these two. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question about
So you're saying 12 would be what you would propose, and you're willing to go down to 10, or this is just the magic number with the FDA, greater than 12?
No, again, like if you have less than 12, you could justify it some other way. I mean, like look, I mean, FDA looks at the totality of like the study that you provide, not necessarily just one thing. So if it's less, it's not going to be a guarantee that you're not going to get it. But I think like if you're trying to design the study with that sweet spot in mind, like kind of go back to one of these previous slides, like this is supposed to be an 80-20 rule. Like I think trying to design for that sweet spot, I would recommend 12 readers.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. All right. To file or not to file or note to file? That is the question. Y'all probably know what this is going to be about. Like this topic has come up a lot of times, right? I don't know who wants to start about this, like how to handle ongoing changes. And maybe we'll scope the conversation down since we're talking about AI, but specifically for AI, yeah, what's been your thoughts on like if a client asks you like what would be enough where we have to file another 510K, either a special or a full one, like
So
any
the
thoughts on
FDA has two guidance documents, modifications for 510K and then software modifications, and it's pretty open to interpretation. But as a rule, what I found is some companies will say that if we add a feature or we go from a software version, let's say 3 to 4, those would be the thresholds. And then maybe version 3.1, 3.2, provided that they work within the guidance documents, those would be your so-called letter to file. I don't know if that's been other people's experiences.
I mean, no, no, I don't know. A lot of times when we're talking about this, we're talking about like kind of a matrix of possible risks to the patient introduced by a change and the likelihood and severity. I think AI kind of complicates this a lot because, with a standard new feature or development change, it's kind of a deterministic. It's very easy to reason about, is this going to introduce a new risk or not, or modify an existing risk. I think AI is kind of making that difficult in that, sometimes you're talking about these large kind of black box outputs, and it can be harder to kind of fit things into that same matrix.
Yeah, I think one of the problems that comes up is that when you make changes, you do the so-called letter to the files, that taken alone, one change is not a problem, but over a period of time, you can get away from your original 510K. And then when you decide to submit a 510K, it can be problematic of how you got to this point because you have your release software already. So I always look at it, as you were just saying before about risk. Why are you making the change? Is it because you've discovered a risk, or is it because of a complaint? And if it's because of a complaint, then you have to put it into your system, have a cap. That opens you up when the FDA comes in, they're gonna see you made a change because of this, and then that could bring up the question, why didn't you submit a new 510K? So it's not a black and white decision, and it always comes down to, like you said, risk. You have to have the risk analysis. But the other thing I'll say about if you add a feature, okay, and you do a letter to file, and your competitors are watching you, maybe they're not monitoring you, but let's say they submit a 510K and they use you as the predicate device, you want to avoid a situation where the FDA is reviewing the predicate device and they say they never had clearance for it. That's one way it can backfire on you. So those are just kind of like real life stories in a way. And so, yeah, you have to make changes, but it's how you handle them. Any thoughts?
Do y'all think this diagram I'm doing here is like accurate to what was said before? Sorry, I'm like backtracking back to what we said, but and this is kind of circular. It's like, well, we are we have a convention that we're gonna change the version numbers depending on the outcome of like what we think. But this is like one way to capture it. Is this what you guys have seen as like kind of a common practice?
I normally see versioning being tied to the extent of change rather than necessarily to regulatory actions. You know what I mean? Because that's always one step further. Yeah, but as a concept, this makes sense to me that if you had the right balance, then this is how it would occur.
Yeah, like this could be the way to like tie together the regulatory team and the software engineering team. It's like we'll have a one matrix for like regulatory type changes. What would, I guess I need to go back to, yeah, like what would consider a minor version change on like the software engineering side? Like this could be a cybersecurity update would be one of these, or minor bug fix or something. And then you would harmonize that to the regulatory side of what that means. Well, that's almost certainly just a note to file example. Anyway, if this is a more substantial change, maybe, I'm not sure if Josh would come up with an example, but this could be no new requirements, or maybe like I don't know if it's like low risk features or something. But anyway, yeah, like some way to harmonize the two. And
To hear your thoughts on this first point where you say retraining the algorithm you think does not constitute enough for for change for another 510K. The reason I ask is I've seen some recent clearances that have PCCPs authorized as part of that, and they've definitely included retraining of algorithm with new data as part of the PCCP, which indicates to me that that would have been otherwise been significant enough to require a 510K in the absence of a PCCP.
Was that a big company or a small company that you seen this?
To look, but they were familiar names.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The reason
Yeah.
why I'm saying it, in my experience, I've found big corporations tend to be very conservative, and so they may choose to do something that a smaller company might say, I disagree. I would have done a letter to file. So I'm
Mm,
not asking for any names. It's just that this has been my experience too, that,
yeah.
you know, larger companies, they tend to be more conservative. Sometimes they have former FDA on their staff, or they have lawyers, and they can survive the
Mm,
the, the time. Not saying that the ends justify the means, but that's just
Yeah,
what,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, like I think that's what it comes down to. I think it's like the risk tolerance of the particular institution. Like, and there's kind of a soft line somewhere between where do you draw the line between what's a note file versus a special 510K. And like larger companies tend to be a lot more conservative, so they'll put the threshold way down here. So if there's a change, maybe I'll say retraining kind of is probably somewhere on this thing, and probably all the way on the right here would be new indication. We can probably all agree that hey, that's probably going to be a new file, and probably all the way on the left side here is like a cybersecurity update, which FDA has made clear that they don't want, or like that's something they don't need like a special 510K to include. So
Yeah.
where you draw the line here is kind of variable. And the new tool that we have available now is the PCCP. So with the PCCP, it's designed to get changes that before was in this like gray zone. But with the PCCP, now you can get more confidence baked in, and you get blessing from FDA that says, okay, like for retraining, we have blessed your verification strategies such that it's no longer like a judgment call. Um,
mm,
but it's not it's not required, right? This is for if you want to de-risk it further, which I think is a good idea, especially if you're a more conservative group, and otherwise it would have required just a whole bunch of special 510Ks. You could save a lot of money, right? Doing one PCCP. But yeah, that's my interpretation of it. It's like we have this new tool now where you don't have to guess, is it a note file or is it a special, which one is it?
Yeah. I think another thing too, when I started my career, it was with physical devices. So it was pretty black and white as far as how you could change the device and whether or not you had to do a recall or things like that. And I think because software, you can make changes instantaneously. How does the FDA differentiate the rules? Because the rules, once again, are really written for physical devices. And so I think this tool you're talking about, the PCCP, is to fill that gap.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's been other people's experiences or understandings.
My kind of reading between the lines, like if you put yourselves in the shoes of FDA, right? I think like one concern be like we just got so many of these special 510Ks or whatever that were just like low risk, and it was just clogging the pipeline.
Yeah,
So they're thinking, well, how can we reduce the workload and also make it easier for like med device manufacturers to get these changes without having to always ask us.
yeah,
And so I believe like that was one reason for PCCP. I think the other reason was for AI to be able to have AI that like continuously updates and retrains itself out in the field. I think that PCCP is like the only way to really do that. But yeah, I think putting yourself in the shoes of FDA, like why did they come out with this? I've always found that to be a helpful exercise, and
yeah,
I think
and I think it helps to try to understand that so we can make the right judgment call of like where to put this threshold is really hard. But if you consider FDA and their challenges of how to manage limited resources and maximize safety of the public, like it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And that also helps me help identify like these terms they use. Like when they say new risk, or when they say it is a significant change, they're leaving a lot open to interpretation. And I always come back to the examples that they give in their guidance, and also putting myself in the shoes of FDA. It's like why they put out this guidance.
To kind of expand on that a little bit, I really like that train of thought, because a lot of times when I think about this, I think of like what is like going up a level, like what kind of root question of like what is the purpose of all of this? And like to me, a PCCP is kind of like you can just think about it in terms of like, going outside of the like kind of formal regulatory framework. Like if you were to just ask a favor of someone, like, hey, can I crash at your house? People usually like a heads up for
Yeah.
surprises. Like if you're like, hey, can I crash at your house? And by the way, Tuesday, I'm going to have all my bandmates over and we're going to be practicing really, really loud. Like it's nice to give, the person a heads up versus Tuesday at, you know, 5 minutes before your band practice, you tell them. So I think a
Yeah.
lot of this also just comes down to like, kind of going back to the, like what provides the most value while being not overly burdensome. It's like I think both sides want the same thing really. And that's kind of what this is getting at.
Yeah, I agree. I think also another thing with the special 510K is that I often tell people that FDA literally has to drop what they're doing to work on a special 510K. When you submit a special 510K, FDA has 30 days to make a decision, and it better be the right decision. And so, like you said, with software, Yujan, people can submit, a lot of special 510Ks, and FDA could be overwhelmed with them. And if let's say the knee-jerk reaction is to put them on hold, then that's just going to tie up resources from the FDA and everybody else. You have to have the 10-day meetings and things of that nature. So this is probably, like you said, they're looking at what can they do to still stay within the regulatory framework and come up with, a compromise.
Yeah.
They're not going to tell us this, like we have to infer this, but I think right now, between all the things that the FDA has to do, where now if your 510K gets put on hold, you have a 10-day meeting. And if you do it within a certain time, you can get a Q sub. Uh, and then meanwhile, people are using FDA as almost like consultants with the Q sub. Internally, the FDA is probably saying, how do I handle all this? Because, I'm not getting more resources. And meanwhile, they're regulating other products probably where they should probably be made exempt. You don't need a 510K, like physical products. And so I think that this is one of the things happening, and who knows, now with the new uh, change in politics, if Elon Musk is going to look at what they're doing at FDA and saying, why are you, not allowing companies to, make their own decisions? How can you, guarantee that you're protecting the public? Maybe you're not, and we're just creating a lot of paperwork and leave it up to the companies. And then if they make the wrong decision, that's when you send in the investigators and see how, they weren't following good practices.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. I would definitely agree with all that's said here. Is like I think the reasons, and I think if we go and look at the timeline between when did the note to file guidance come out, when did special 510Ks come into existence, I bet we'll see a pattern. Like at some point it was maybe just the traditional 510K, and then maybe it's
Yeah.
okay, we're getting way too many of these like small changes. Let's do
I,
a special.
I was alive during that time and I remember it. And that was when it was political change, when the Republicans, Newt Gingrich when they were in charge, the FDA had to react. And so in the late 90s, that's when they came up with the concept of special 510K. And then they also had, the modifications. And when that happened, it was during a period where the FDA was being accused of, not getting things cleared or approved, and then also about the public learning that medical devices have a different regulatory scheme than let's say drugs, where medical devices, like 90% of the approvals are just 510Ks, which are paperwork exercises as opposed to like clinical trials. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that's when those changes happen, the special 510Ks and other guidance documents. And I think we're entering a period where that might happen, again, where the FDA will be forced to maybe say these types of devices, we're not going to require 510Ks. And then, maybe software products, they'll either force you to do, PCCPs or, come up with different rules to get things through quicker. Because another thing I'm wondering, they don't publish this metrics, but does anyone get a 510K cleared in 90 days anymore? I'm just saying that rhetorically. It seems like everybody gets an AI letter. It's almost like you don't get an AI letter. Why? Did the FDA not review your application? And then and with the eSTAR template, there's a lot of obstacles that will automatically, you have an AI letter. So I don't know if other people have seen that or wondered the same thing.
Yeah, my experience for like lower risk, more straightforward LLZ, for example, those have gone through recently without getting an AI letter. But I would agree that most other cases you always get a FDA AI letter. So I wouldn't mark that as like a negative outcome.
No.
It's just part of the process at this point. One other thing I would add to the PCCP, the way I've kind of internalized this with my like software engineering type brain, is it's a lot like test-driven development, where test-driven development is a practice where you write your tests for your software first, and those tests initially fail because the software isn't written yet, or like the feature doesn't perform as the target. But then like what you could do, like once you've written the test, you could delegate the task to like another engineer, or even give it to a completely different engineering firm, and you've essentially like pre greenlit what you think is going to be a acceptable level of performance. And I kind of think of it as similar, like the PCCP is a way you could pre-verify your verification and validation approach with FDA without having a completed product at this point. But then FDA can greenlight that, and they're stamping that your procedure looks good, and if your software passes those tests, then they agree that you can make those changes without having to go back and ask for permission. So that's how I've thought about it. And that opens up some interesting concepts, like the one mentioned, or the one we're talking about here in this diagram. It could unlock some opportunities where you could submit a 510K sooner, even though some of your features aren't done. You could submit it sooner with a PCCP that outlines your testing methodology, and perhaps like that could be yet one other way to use the PCCP, not necessarily just for post-market changes, but also to accelerate pre-market as well. Any thoughts on that, or
So is this how you're envisioning it?
That this is one use case of the PCCP that I'm thinking about.
Okay.
Where like say that you have an algorithm, the core algorithm's done, but all the plumbing for that algorithm, like the cloud deployment, all the infrastructure isn't done yet. But you don't want to take the risk of doing all that as a node to file. Like it kind of comes back to this threshold. Like you don't want to put this threshold all the way up here. But I think there's a case where you could get that core algorithm submitted and then with a PCCP promise to do these downstream things and outline the test cases that you would use for those. And you can submit your 510K several months in advance and then build out those features while you wait for that clearance to come through.
Yeah. That would be nice.
I mean, there is a flip side to this, right? In that with the PCCP, you are kind of making a promise, so you're kind of handcuffing yourself a little bit to a certain path forward. It's almost like maybe another software parallel would be publishing a specification in advance, like saying, okay, in the future, we're going to be implementing this feature. Here's what the API is going to look like. And you can, same kind of thing where you can kind of get yourself into a corner where people start building upon the new spec. And so you can't, you can't make changes because people are already relying on what you promised.
Yeah. Just to clarify though, Josh, just because you have a predetermined change protocol doesn't mean that you have to execute it. Like you could just shelve it forever.
Yeah.
Right, right. But if you wanted to make the change, you're right in that you are boxed into that, or you risk invalidating the PCCP, and then you're back to this question, well, is it a note to file or is it a special? Like you're back to this gray zone.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And potentially have to scrap, a bunch of work you did putting together the PCCP in the first place.
Right, right.
Yeah, I find the PCCP to be a good commercial tool as well as a regulatory strategy tool, in that it could, quicken revenue generation if by getting to market earlier. So I think that can be helpful for a lot of startups who can just kind of get their V1 out. But on the flip side, I think the PCCP talks about cumulative changes. So here on your diagram, you talk about version 3.0 development deployment. At that point, you're assuming that you followed through version 2 and you haven't canned it. Because if you did, and somehow there was an interaction between 2 and 3, now you're in the situation where you're back to, okay, where do we draw the line now? So I think it's a great tool, but I think cross-functionally, product people need to be on board and they need to have done their discovery and whatnot to be able to put into a PCCP as a formal commitment, I guess. So that can be always challenging, but it's worth it if that gives you quicker entry to market to begin with.
Yeah, and that's also an excellent point, is that the PCCP requires you to have sometimes even a crystal ball. Like you need to know what changes you're going to make at a fairly concrete level. Like you don't want to have abstract changes or like a changes that could significantly change the device, especially the like device intended use. That could be difficult to do looking long range, right? I mean, that's the whole reason, like why we have like agile software development is it's really difficult to predict what the market wants before you actually deploy it. So I think you're absolutely right. That limits the utility of the PCCP from thinking too far ahead. But if you know ahead of time what you need, I think this is especially true for like AI companies. Like you have a lot of AI companies that are trying to add multiple AI indications, and they kind of know what it is already. It's like, hey, we want to start out with lung, and then we want to do heart or whatever. Like they kind of can plan it out. Then in that case, I think a PCCP is reasonable. But if you don't know what product market fit is, what you want, like you're right, like it might be a big waste of time to do all that upfront. And also it also adds some risk to the first 510K. Like you are pulling in risks in the future, you're pulling them into the present, which sometimes that might not be worth it. So yeah, definitely things to consider before you do PCCP. Maybe we'll continue this next week since we only have 2 minutes left. Maybe I'll talk about, yeah, 2 minutes can be hard. But yeah, anything more on the PCCPs that you guys think are useful to discuss?
I'm good.
Cool. Now let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Sorry for the late notice for everybody. It looks like we've got a question from Cooper. Thanks a lot, Cooper. The question is, how specific does the PCCP need to be? For example, if I wanted to integrate software with hardware devices, can the PCCP say we're going to add in devices and test all with XYZ protocol modified to each device are appropriate? Or do you have to list out every single device when you consider adding it preemptively? I would say as specific as you can get, I think the better. You will have an opportunity to go back and forth with FDA during the probably during the FDA AI letter. They'll probably say, oh, like we don't agree with the PCCP. It's too broad. So I would recommend like maybe going a little bit broader and then meet the FDA kind of in the middle somewhere. But yeah, unfortunately I don't have any concrete advice for what I would do in this case.
Say even before the submission in a pre-sub, putting this question in front of the FDA, right? And then I think the FDA also encourages that you discuss PCCPs in a pre-sub. So that could be another thing to consider.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also PCCPs can be added on, like after you've already had a product in the market, you want to add on a PCCP, that could be done too. So yeah, really like it's a tool, I think, to de-risk this note to file, not note to file choice, and to move that risk earlier on into product development, so you can de-risk it in parallel to actually being developed. So you don't have this weird thing like, well, we've already developed it, we're going to release it, but do we do a special? But then if we do a special, you have to wait to release it. But marketing's not going to like that, and it's not good for the business, and it's not good for patients. So it can be used as a tool to break that tie. And then in a perfect world, you get a PCCP cleared first, then you build it in parallel, and as soon as the feature is done, you can execute the PCCP and also get that feature released on day one with very little risk. Like you don't have to ask the question, note to file special, are we going to get audited? Is this going to be a finding later? So anyway, guys, I got to run, but thank you so much for your participation, especially on short notice.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope to see you guys again next week. And definitely remember the golden rule to definitely design for others as you would yourself. And then after that, find the least burdensome pathway.
I love it.
All right.
Bye now.
See ya.
Thanks. It's fine. Bye.